Hi, my name is Lanaya Preston, and I will be presenting on The Secret of Cosmetics, a project that is going to be developed by PresTech Company. So, essentially, what we have nowadays is a humongous cosmetics industry. The cosmetics industry makes $445 billion in sales annually currently, and those sales are continuing to grow as new companies emerge, different products emerge. It is expanding at an increasingly rapid rate. If you are caught up into any of today's news, YouTube stars such as Patrick Starr and Jackie Aina, they continue to get deals with big brand name cosmetic companies to come out with new products, and everybody's continuously trying to have the next big trend. Now, the problem with this is that the industry has minimal FDA regulations that enable cosmetic companies to actually hide information about their ingredients list. The FDA really only controls food and drugs, so consumables for the most part, and this leaves a lot of questionables in cosmetics because they're not consumed, they're put on the skin and the body. And a lot of companies do not want to readily expose their ingredients list because to them, it's their livelihood. It was kind of the same argument with food. If people see your ingredients, they can recreate it. But the problem is we have no forced recall on these products when a harmful chemical is discovered in them, when cancerogens or chemicals known to give birth defects are involved. So with minimal regulation, with companies not having to disclose all of their ingredients to the public, how are companies being held accountable? And also, do we really know how unsafe they are being? Do we know if there are regulations in place and if they are trying or if they are self-regulating? We don't know any of that information. The cosmetic industry in general is really moving towards the small and upcoming brands. They're gaining traction based on their advertisements for pure and organic ingredients. Pure and organic ingredients are kind of what is the trend now. People want to know what's on their skin, and they want to pay more for knowing what's on their skin. So with consumers facing that way, has the industry even changed? Do we even know this information? Is there less chemicals being used? It's really a question. So reputation is also vital in this in the cosmetic industry as well. So a lot of companies are based off of reputation, which makes them wanting to hide their harmful chemicals in their ingredients list even more. Luckily, as we continue to progress towards this more, I want to know what's happening and what I'm exposed to, legislation is trying to increase safety regulations within cosmetic and beauty industries. It's actually gotten agreements in the Senate and trying to pass through the House of Representatives. Now, this information came back in March, so it's a little unclear as to how much movement we can actually have. And past efforts have failed, but we're actually more solidified because we've never actually gotten any regulations in the beauty industry this far in the past. Now, when it comes to research in cosmetics, we have a complete lack of publicly accessible information. Yes, companies create their own research and they use their own studies in order to determine if they can use a product, but us as consumers, we're not able to access that information, and a lot of companies don't publish it. So what studies that have been performed are very limited. 2014, an informational article for cosmetologists was released. So this was a peer-reviewed, scientifically proven article that basically was a summary of all the possible risks that cosmetologists are exposed to on a daily basis. They are exposed to cancerogenous products, and then they also are exposed to products that give birth disorders or are known to give birth disorders. So it's just basically listing all of that information, but no research was made into how many products or what products these are or anything along those lines. 2015, there was more research where the Center for Disease Control studied chemical exposure in personal care and consumer products. So they were looking at what chemicals you're being exposed to, what levels and things along those lines. But again, that was limited because we're not looking into cosmetics. We're looking into instead things like shampoo. We're looking into things such as conditioners, but not my skin regimen or what makeup I'm using. And again, this is for the same problem that a lot of this information wasn't disclosed. But in 2005, we actually come to the California Safety Cosmetics mandate, which basically forced companies to release information about what ingredients they have, when they're recalling certain chemicals, when they're changing their formula, when they're just simply removing chemicals from their formula, and just keeping an updated record of what ingredients for what brands and products that they have. And the California Safe Cosmetics Program took this information, put it into a publicly accessible database, and released a brief summary of the data related to the ingredients mandate. But this data was very limited in what they were doing. They actually did not release specific information as into what companies were the top dealers, what companies had chemical lists that were the longest, what patterns, yearly patterns are happening within the chemical usage. They didn't explore these different questions. They kind of just gave an overview of like, this is the top chemical that companies are using and this is what it does. So there's really like a large gap, but available information solely in California. Now, what I propose is actually kind of a exploration of this data and combining it with occupational health data so that we can see how we relate to the industry standards and how the companies are reacting to known chemical exposure incidents and known accidents that could cause prolonged exposure cases. So essentially, we're taking a critical view to determine what level of self-regulation and safety is currently placed within the cosmetic industry. So we're going to be exploring the safety within them, and we're going to do that by aligning chemical exposure information with chemicals and cosmetic data. So what this will do is give us an idea of where incidents are migrating from and what the response to those migrating incidents are. I mean, companies don't want to be held responsible, and you can consider the amount of exposure of the workplace to be very comparable to that of a person using a product daily. So we kind of want to see what relationship we can build between the two because we now have access to true and government regulated data and the cosmetic chemical data, so we can align the two. We get to use time frames to determine if the cosmetic industry is lagging in the removing of harmful chemicals, if they take 2 years when a case has been closed, 3 years in the past. And we want to take a further look into the safety of cosmetics and make information available to the public because, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these different companies are based out of reputation and they want to have their information non-disclosed, or they don't want to release studies if those studies are not favorable. So this is just giving an unobjective view of what's happening within the cosmetic fields. We hope something positive is happening, but we really don't know. So we have to take a look at both if it's bad or good and what the changes have been within the past 9 years. So the main key organizations, PresTech, the organization running the study, essentially what I'm naming the company or my company currently, we are a third-party investigative organization using student talent to explore commonly overlooked data issues. So any publicly available data that hasn't been thoroughly analyzed, or any data in general that a partner nonprofit or anything wants us to look at for them, we would do for essentially a lower price due to the student credit that's given. But the main key factors and the main companies in general that are looking at this issue of chemical exposure, and specifically chemical exposure in cosmetics, first is the California Department of Public Health. They're the ones that push for the mandate to get the ingredients list, and they created the California Safe Cosmetics Program, which made this ingredient information publicly available and searchable, and it's being tracked on a yearly basis, or any real time that a company is changing their formula or trying to get a new product out. There's also the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is run by the U.S. Department of Labor, and they have funded efforts to keep track of the safety and health in the workplace. This involves any cases due to unfair work practices, unsafe work conditions, as well as occupational depression, workers' comp for injuries, all things related to that. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration does. They also look into chemical exposure cases and keep track of those and report those publicly. In our project, we have two types of stakeholders I like to define. The direct stakeholders, so those whose finances or daily life is impacted by the results, and those who are indirect or have broader interests. So their interests have a much larger scope, and cosmetics is one part of their mission. So for direct stakeholders, we have consumers and cosmetic companies. So consumers, yes, they're using the products every single day, so they would be of interest in a study to this degree, looking into the safety of the cosmetic industry. And then cosmetic companies would also be of interest because those who are not involved in the study, who do not have harmful chemicals, would benefit, and it may harm other larger cosmetic companies if that information showed that they have made no changes into safety and continue to use cancerogenous or birth defect causing consumables within their products. So those two are directly or the most impacted by a study looking into the safety of chemicals in cosmetics. An indirect or broader interest are consumer safety organizations. Consumer safety organizations, they look at a lot of different consumables. They look at things within the food and drug. They also fight for GMOs, usage and disusage and things along those lines. So their scope is much broader, but cosmetics definitely is a part of their scope. And they have been helping in legislation in the past to help push information to be released about cosmetics. There's also the state health departments, which once they get more funding, they can also look into this cosmetic issue, and it would help their overall mission to help public health. You also have the Food and Drug Administration, which does regulate the industry so far. Yes, they have minimal regulation ability, but this could help them to have more control once the public sees this information and companies are being held accountable. As well as dermatologists, because they work with the skin and they deal with patients who have severe acne scars, who have side effects from makeup brands. So they definitely have a hand in all of this. So for our business specifically wants to further explore trends within cosmetics industries. We want to determine the linkage between potential harmful chemicals and chemical exposure cases. So we want to look at the cosmetic chemicals and compare that to what is happening with those OSHA chemical exposure cases and how they're reacting, what's happening, what's the differences between the two, and how the cases relate to each other. And lastly, we want to identify reaction differences between product recalls and chemical exposure cases, like I mentioned before. So we want to establish a linkage, see if we can possibly predict when chemicals will be recalled based off of the number of cases, and then see if there's a difference between product recalls and then the chemical exposure, like what our reaction is as well. In order to become successful in this project, there are two main hurdles that we have to overcome. We have to align chemical names. So the data set for the chemicals in cosmetic and the data set for the chemicals in work exposure cases both have chemical names that can be linked to each other so that you can see the chemical usage and see what each database as well. But the problem between those two is that chemicals can be written in their common names and then they can also be written in their scientific names. So we have to make a third party, possibly a third party transformation so that we have everything in the same language so that they can be compared. This is not hard because there are definitely chemical indexes that make this process easy, but we do have to take this into account and it is going to take some time in order to make the proper alignments. Also, we have to combine the OSHA data sets, so the chemical exposure and the workplace data sets, into one file. Essentially, the data set's broken into a combination of XML and CSV files, and I've done preliminary alignments for them, and certain years cause particular issues within SQL Server constraints. So that has to be assessed and the data must be put together into one. For the project, we have some key performance indicators. We want to look into resource utilization. So how much of our time is spent researching how to fix the problem versus fixing the problem or doing an action. So we want to see how much time we're spending thinking or looking at techniques for fixing or for completing a task, and then versus how much time it actually takes to do the task. Also, we want to create a budget cost of work schedule, which will be based off of the standard data scientist rate here in Hawaii, and that will give you a final budget analysis for how much we expect the task to take versus number 3, our actual cost of work performed. So how much time it actually took to complete a task or, for example, clean the data or align the chemical names, that type of thing. And then we want to see what the difference is and how much we're underestimating or overestimating time. This helps to keep the project on track so that we can complete within the time frame given. So we have 2 different data sets of equal importance. So we have the chemicals and cosmetics data set. That has over 88,000 rows and includes information on the brand for the cosmetics, chemicals that they use, and then tracked usage for the chemicals. So all of this information is vital in determining the safety, how the regulations are being perceived, how dangerous the products are in terms of the chemicals. And it's also the basis of our study because it's the only readily available data set that contains a list of ingredients and company brands as well. A lot of different states don't have these same regulations, and theirs is really the only one that we have that's publicly available right now. And the data set that we're using is from 2009 to 2018. Our second data set is a chemical exposure and workplace data set. It has over 500,000 rows and it has chemical exposure cases across America. This is important because it gives us an idea of the standards that we currently have to meet because it has, for example, the amount of the exposure levels. So we can look at that to see what qualifies as a case or an inexcusable amount of workplace chemical exposure. It also tells us how what areas that exposure cases or certain chemicals are central to. And then we also see as well how that once we align it to chemicals and cosmetics, we can really get an idea of how the cosmetic industry is stacking up to other industry standards. So if we've gotten 3 cases of chemical exposures in triglycerine or something, and the chemicals in cosmetics or data set shows that no companies have removed it from their working list of cosmetics, then we can see there's a serious problem here, because people who are being daily exposed to these chemicals are sending in OSHA forms, and we're getting cases out, legal cases that show that the chemical exposure levels are harmful, but we're still giving it to people to use on their skin every single day. So definitely it's important to align these two, and the chemical exposure in the workplace really does tell us what is a qualifiable issue, what chemicals are problems, because they've made cases out of them and these cases have passed. So in order to do this, we have 2 data sets. Like I said, we have the chemical and cosmetics, and then the chemical exposures in the workplace. So chemical and cosmetics has both a company name and a chemical name that we can align to the chemical exposure in the workplace, establishment name, and substance. So on a smaller scale, so most likely not be that many cases, you can see what companies do have issues in chemical exposure in the workplace. So do know that it's a harmful ingredient, and you can make that analysis that way. Or with the broader scope that we're taking is you can align the chemicals and see what chemical patterns that there are, so that way you compare to a larger basis. And that's really what this study is going to do. It's going to be looking at, I have triglyceride. How many triglyceride exposure cases have there been where it's been harmful for people? I know it's been harmful. This data is publicly available. My company is at risk. And am I still using it? So that's essentially what we want to look at. Look at the descriptive factors about the company's movement and their usage of the chemical when that change happened, and look at the chemical exposures in the workplace in order to see how it compares to our exposure cases. We would want it to be that we discovered it and removed it from our chemical beforehand, but do we really know? And is that really happening within the industry? As well as what direct cases are a result of this high chemical usage, and that would be made through a connection between the company name and the establishment name. So both of these alignments are going to give us a lot of information as to the industry and what's happening. There are ample observations that you can make within these 2 data sets alone, and once you make the connections, will be there. I've done preliminary data alignments. I found recalled danger or products with chemicals that are dangerous having chemical exposures in the workplace. So I've tested the theory. I found also certain establishment names as well in the chemical exposures in the workplace. So now the next step is really developing a overall system so that it's not manual and that the connections are made for analysis, but they are there and they can be found. And we have ample amount of data from both sides, from the 88,000 rows in the chemicals and cosmetics, as well as the over 500,000 chemical exposure cases to look at. So there's definitely enough there that we can make a connection. And a lot of these products, their chemicals have been removed. There's been edits to the chemical formula, so we can definitely look and see what the companies have done. So if this is a live presentation, I'd ask for further questions, but if there are any more questions about the product, then yes, feel free to talk to me. But overall, we're really looking at it, we're trying to expose to the light an industry that's usually hidden. We want to take a critical look, an unobjective view into the cosmetic industry and how their chemical usage is being tracked or even self-regulated, because the FDA is not regulating it to the level of other brands such as food and drugs. So that's what our main scope is, to just look at the safety of the cosmetic industry. And we're using chemicals and cosmetic data set, which has known cancerogens and birth defect causing chemicals within it. And we're aligning that against industry, like our government standards for the OSHA cases, the chemicals in workplace exposure cases. Because looking at those basically tells us here's the industry standard, and then we look at here's the cosmetic industry, how are they reacting to each other, or how do they compare. So that is essentially my project and what I want to explore. I believe it will be helpful to the numerous consumers that are purchasing these products. I think it would be helpful to dermatologists and all the stakeholders involved. It's also very helpful for a lot of cosmetic brands, especially those up and coming, because they see what's wrong with the industry, and they can see why and have a basis for the reason for their rebranding and why they want to be pure and organic. So that's essentially the project, and there's a lot to look at, and there's a lot of possibilities to analyze and connections to draw within it. So I hope you find it interesting, and I hope I explained it pretty well. Again, my name is Lanaya Preston, and my project is The Secret of Cosmetics.